trauma doesn't always announce itself. It walks into the classrooms and pews wearing a smile. It hides behind things like perfectionism, silence, or anger. And sometimes we can even re-traumatize people without even realizing it. In this episode, we sit down with trauma therapist Danielle Barnard, who helps us understand what trauma really looks like, how it affects the brain, how it shapes behavior, and what it takes to build trauma-informed spaces in our churches, our communities, and our schools. Because we can't be a place of healing if we don't understand the wounds that people carry. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our third installment of our mental health awareness series, Real Talk. Today, we're joined by Danielle Barnard. Let me just bring her on, and then I'll let her introduce herself. Danielle, it is good to have you on with us. Please tell us a little bit about yourself before we begin.
Of course. Thank you, David. My name is Danielle Bernard. I am a licensed social worker, a certified trauma professional, a practicing therapist, and trauma is my specialty. I work with clients of all ages to heal from trauma, to process trauma, the impact of trauma, but I also work in my own business, Living the Healing, where I provide workshops and trainings for individuals, for communities, as well as consultation for businesses to become more trauma-informed, more equitable, and more person-focused.
So I have you on because I heard a fantastic presentation that you did on creating safe spaces within churches for trauma. And so I thank you for coming on. But to sort of start us off, how, Danielle, would you define trauma? And how does it show up differently than, say, something like everyday stress?
Trauma, I would say that trauma is either it can be a single event, it can be a series of events, but what really defines it is it's something that overwhelms a person's ability to cope. So it can be something that shakes their sense of safety, a sense of identity, self-worth. It can be from a personal experience, so individual trauma such as abuse or assault. It could be a collective experience. So something such as systemic oppression, violence, the global pandemic, for example, is one example of a collective experience of trauma. But what really is key to trauma that's different from stress is that it disrupts our ability to function. So stress is a normal thing. It can impact us. It can cause a lot of different symptoms, but trauma can impact not only how we function, but how we see the world, how we're able to form relationships, even our ability to process and connect with our own emotions.
So, Danielle, is it possible? Can you walk us through sort of what happens in the body, in the brain, when someone experiences trauma? Because I don't want people to just think that it's just about something bad that's happened to us.
Yes, this is often where I start when I'm working individually with folks
Hmm.
in therapy. And I like to use different models, but one of the models is the hand model. So the idea of our brain being a hand. And when we experience trauma, what happens is our lid flips. So essentially, the amygdala, which is the emotional center of the brain, perceives a threat. It could be anything. It could be a threat of an attack. It could be just an event that feels threatening to us. And our body begins to release stress hormones such as adrenaline and cortisol to prepare it for immediate action, to respond to this threat. And when that happens, stress hormones are elevated for a long period of time, which then affects our prefrontal cortex, which is our decision making and judgment center of the brain. And so that dampens because when we are under threat, we don't need to think about what the threat is, analyze the threat, go through pros and cons of if this is a threat or not. We need to be able to react. So our ability to make decisions, to reason, becomes less active and it deactivates. And so trauma survivors often, even after a trauma event, if they're experiencing a trigger, it can affect their ability to think clearly. And so our lid is flipped. We're not able to think clearly. We're not able to make decisions. And that chronic adrenaline, that chronic cortisol is left in the body, which then has impacts on our physical health. So, sleep disturbances, problems with digestion, high blood pressure. It can affect a number of things. So, it's both a physiological and a psychological response that happens.
So thank you for that, Danielle. I think that that helps us sort of normalize what trauma is, but trauma also doesn't always look like crisis. So, what are some subtle or unexpected ways that trauma shows up, not just in people's physical physiological responses, but what about their behavioral responses? How do we act out sort of our traumas?
Yes, I think some very common ways that we might
Hmm.
notice even in ourselves. So, one that I think comes up a lot is hypervigilance. So, that constant state of alertness. It's that person that's like, I'm never going to sit with my back facing a door. So, that, for example, is hypervigilance. You're constantly scanning the room for threats. Even if there is no immediate danger, you're prepared for danger. Irritability can be an example. So if someone is, and that's irritability does not always equal trauma, but it is something that can show up if someone has experienced trauma. Um, Being easily startled, for example. So anytime someone walks in a room and a person is startled immediately, that can be an example of a response to something that happened. An avoidance is one as well. So possibly avoiding certain emotions, avoiding situations that might bring up memories, withdrawing from people, avoiding deep emotional connections to protect themselves. I think one other could also be self sabotage. So
Hmm.
when we undermine ourselves and our ability to do well due to like fears that we have of being unworthy or that we're going to fail, which generally comes from some trauma related sense of shame. So it can be a number of things, or even compulsive behaviors, overeating, overworking can be a sign of trauma. Uh, Substances, different things that we utilize to cope with pain can be signs of trauma. They don't equal trauma, but they can be related to it.
Yeah. Stop telling people my business. I think it's important for us to sort of unpack that a little bit more. Because a lot of people can't explain why they do certain things, and they oftentimes don't want to attach what they do to what has happened to them. So
Mhm.
how do you sort of help people make that connection between sort of their behavior and the past unchosen learning that trauma has sort of forced on them?
Mhm. Well, I think the best example I can give of that is when I'm working individually in session with someone. And so someone might come in and say, I realize that I have this constant need to perform, or I have this desire to always keep it together. I feel like I'm an imposter. I feel like I'm going to lose my job at any minute because I'm not able to keep it together. And I like to dive deeper into that. So one way to really think, where did this come from? And see the fact that I say that one, all of our behavior is functional. So we behave in certain ways because it has either been supportive for us, there has been some type of reward for that behavior. The behavior is a reflection of us trying to meet our needs and us trying to protect ourselves.
Mhm.
And so we're constantly working for, like, our brain is constantly working for that. So we will behave in ways that do that. And so I always ask the question, who told you that? Where did that come from? Whose voice is that in?
Mm.
What's the story behind that? And generally people are able to go back and they think, well, I remember when this happened, this is how I responded, or I saw my parents do X, Y, and Z, or when I was entering my career, I had this experience. And so being able to connect it to actual events, one, validates your response because it's a natural response. It helps
Mm-hmm.
us to be supportive for ourselves to say, wow, I was able to navigate and figure out how to cope with this thing. And then it gives us the ability to say, okay, I've been able to cope, but now how I've been able to cope is no longer working.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So I know our children mean a whole lot to us, right? So when it comes to um, children, trauma can shape how they oftentimes see the world and how they can function at church or even at school, right?
Mhm.
What should adults be looking for to sort of help our children who are dealing with traumatic experiences?
Mhm. I think when it comes to observing children's behavior, we have to recognize also look at the context of what is developmentally appropriate for a child of
Hmm.
this age. And so one way to have a baseline is to say, okay, this kid is 8 or 9. At 8 or 9, these are the markers of where this child should be. And some things that might show up are maybe heightened emotional outbursts. So just like adults, kids can have trouble, and not probably more so than adults. They have less tools and less practice in navigating complex emotions. Withdrawing from classmates or teachers, avoidance of certain things. So things I've seen in my work with kids over the years has been if a kid starts to skip over and avoid details of things. So maybe they were a really great student, and then all of a sudden there's a shift. You might be getting more calls from school. A kid might be more anxious and not be able to explain why. Even some regression behavior. So your kid wants to sleep in your room all the time. Your kid is having more tantrums. They might start bedwetting, sucking their thumb. So doing things that are a way of self-soothing. Um, Trouble in church, it might look a little different. So it might look like a kid doesn't want to engage in group activities, or they have a lot of resistance to uh, something that they associate with the trauma. Attachment issues also come up. So struggling to trust their caregivers, struggling to trust authority figures. And so that can lead to some disconnect if a child is in church and they're not able to connect with trusted adults or people we believe are trusted adults that they should trust. That can be something that could reflect some type of trauma.
Sure. Wow. Okay. So, Danielle, we hear a lot about generational or historical trauma, right? What is historical trauma? Or I'll even say, what is racial trauma? What is it? And how do we begin to heal or experience healing in our own communities?
And so, like I said in the question about what happens in the brain and body when trauma occurs, generational and historical trauma can it starts from there. And so trauma itself changes our neural pathways in our brain. It changes how we physiologically respond. Everything about our body changes when we experience trauma. And generational or historical or even racial trauma, research has shown that trauma can be passed down in the body generation to generation. And
Mm,
so it is the transmission of emotional and physiological pain from one generation to the next. And this can be just by virtue of DNA. I did a training several years ago where the presenter was talking about racial trauma, and they shared how certain chronic illnesses that are high risk in African American communities, for example, are connected to historical racial trauma. So, in the transatlantic slave trade, as slaves were being shipped from the continent to the Americas, they had to retain salt and water in order to survive. The people who survived had high salt and water retention. Hypertension, high blood pressure, is something that is historically has high rates in African Americans. That could be a connection, and is likely a connection that those who survived store salt and water. And so those things are seen in our own health factors. They're seen in cultural or family patterns that are transmitted. Um, this is something that is passed down. And so we see it in Black communities. So the historical in the US in particular, historically dealing with the trauma from slavery, segregation, racism, continued effects of systemic oppression, that is a collective trauma that doesn't affect one person, but it affects whole communities.
Wow. You just said a whole lot there. And I want to pivot um, and sort of throw religious trauma in there, or trauma that has been pushed on people by the church. And I want to throw this question at you, and then we'll talk about how we can then create trauma informed spaces. But what is religious trauma? You just beautifully unpacked the historical and racial trauma. What is religious trauma? And what role has the church played in intentionally or unintentionally in creating harm? And I'm going to come off the screen when you talk about this because I don't want to be associated with this answer.
Yes, religious trauma, that is a deep one. I can say that in my work as a therapist, religious trauma comes up often, especially in Black people, because many Black people were raised or connected to the church in some way growing up. And so religious trauma, similar to racial and historical trauma, is physiological and emotional harm, but it's caused by experiences within a religious or spiritual context. And so that's spiritual abuse, manipulation, the use of religious teachings to enforce control. So a focus on conformity and control over people. The use of shame. Shame is a big thing that is used as a way to correct or change behavior within religious contexts. And so the use of shame or guilt can lead to chronic stress and then lead to trauma for people. I think in Black communities in particular, religious trauma can also be the role of traditions perpetuating systems of oppression, particularly when we're thinking about how it's been justified to harm Black people in the United States. And those religious teachings who continue to justify exploitation of people, segregation, how it's utilized to hold up these systems that actually cause harm. And, that's intentional harm, but you said also the unintentional. Unintentionally, we can invalidate and ignore people's struggles, especially when it comes to mental health. When, we sometimes prioritize spiritual healing over actual psychological care. And that can be a source of trauma. It can be in the doctrines that are taught about shame or punishment, sin, that can cause emotional harm. And that's unintentional. We think we're teaching the right thing, but we're actually harming people, harming their self-worth, harming their sense of safety.
All right, Danielle. And so you didn't tell everybody, and I'm gonna tell everybody your business. You are seminary educated. You have undergrad degree in theology, and you did go to the seminary at Andrews. We went to the same seminary. That's interesting that you okay. So help us a little bit, Danielle. A leader that wants to become trauma informed.
Mhm.
Where should they begin? Because one of the things is we've seen a lot of individuals preach sermons that have caused harm, and it was unintentional. They thought they were giving a "Thus saith the Lord," and they didn't go first with the love of the Lord. But how can a leader become trauma informed, and where should they sort of begin?
Mhm. I always say, and I tell this to all of my clients, I say we can't change something that we're not aware of. So awareness empowers us to change. And I think leaders should start with building that awareness. So educating themselves on trauma, the effects of trauma, looking even at their own communities and seeing, okay, where is trauma showing up in the responses of these people? Understanding, more in depth the psychological impact, the emotional, the biological effects, awareness of their own bias, because one of the things that I find often is that a lot of times we don't think we've experienced trauma. Trauma in some ways is subjective. It depends on how someone believes it's affected their ability to cope. And so that can lead to a bias where it's like, well, this didn't affect me, so why would it affect these people? So being aware of our own biases and understandings and how that impacts our interactions with people, how that impacts what we say. Um, and it could also be a good way to start is also to reflect on your own teachings and doctrines. And so seeing how have these actually hindered healing, and not assuming that everything about doctrine and teaching tradition is healing inherently. I think it's important to examine that. Leaders can attend trainings on trauma as well. Oftentimes, trauma trainings are not just for clinicians, but they are for people who are working at the intersections that where they might interact with people before someone even sees a licensed professional. Um, Trainings on trauma-informed care. My own training for church leaders is a great place to start too, whether it's the introductory workshop on creating trauma-informed churches or the full-day training on trauma-informed leadership, which provides congregants and church leaders, pastors, preachers, with the tools to create safe and supportive spaces for their own congregations. And also just taking steps to create a space and culture wherever you are for empathy. So ensuring that people have the tools to be emotionally intelligent leaders that are able to empathize with people, and able to support people regardless of their own experiences.
Yeah. Danielle, that is excellent. There's one other part of this that I want us to take a look at. So, what if someone isn't a leader? What does it mean for us to actually have trauma-informed spaces? And then how does that show up in our day-to-day interactions? And and I know it's a loaded question. So what does a trauma responsive community look like? So if I'm not a leader, if I'm just a regular church member, if I'm just in a classmate in a classroom, if I just operating out of a workspace, how do I foster a trauma responsive community? What does that look like?
Mm-hmm. We don't have a ton of time, but the way that I would summarize it would be that we're taking intentional efforts to, one, recognize that the effects of trauma are present in people. Like we come into different spaces, whether it's school or work, or even into churches, whether it's throughout the week or on the weekends. When we're coming into church, we're coming into a space with a number of people who have had a variety of experiences. And so it's taking intentional effort to make sure our interactions, as well as the environment itself, is safe, supportive, and empowering. And so it's about creating a culture that helps people to feel seen and feel valued. It's about creating psychological safety, with clear, transparent communication. It's recognizing that we're not making assumptions of people's behaviors. It's not, oh, so and so is always like this. It's, you know, what's happening, what's going on with them. I'm noticing that this behavior is a little different than what I might have expected or what I'm used to seeing. Um, it's looking up and offering choices. Providing choice is a way of empowering and creating safety, respecting people's boundaries, using empowering language over shaming language. So instead of, assuming someone wants to talk about what's going on with themselves, it's asking, are you comfortable talking about this?
Right.
Would you prefer to talk about this at another time? Which respects someone's autonomy. trauma is a very disempowering thing. And so trauma informed and trauma responsive spaces help to respect the autonomy and power of an individual. It helped, that in and of itself is healing, to have interactions where that autonomy and power is restored. And
Yeah.
so it creates a space of support, community building, safety. um, Trauma responsive community actively works against things that are causing harm. You know, we're trying to be validating, we're trying to create spaces that people can feel safe and where they can feel that they trust. And that's foundational to creating responsive environments, but also to creating truly healing environments.
Yeah. That is so awesome. I wish we could spend another hour just on that, but then we're definitely going to make sure that people connect with you, so that because I know that this is definitely something that is needed in our own churches, that's needed among our own our my own colleagues. And so
Mhm.
we'll definitely come back to this, and definitely the relationship ministries department will have you back on. But I want to tap into sort of your clinical skills, your compassion. We have many conversations about how your compassion shows up. And so I want to just put this question to you. For this, there may be someone listening that is living with the reality of their unresolved trauma. Um, what's one thing, in your opinion, that they need to hear in order to sort of help them begin to navigate those challenges?
Mhm. I would say that, you know, in earlier in the conversation, I mentioned how trauma affects our whole self. It affects our mind. It changes the neural pathways in our brain. It changes us physiologically and physically. One thing I would say for someone living with unresolved trauma is that it is possible to heal. You know, our bodies and our minds are actively working for healing as well. And so there's nothing that we cannot heal from, we cannot recover from. And I genuinely believe that. I believe that we're able to recover from trauma. You know, we can't change what's happened, but we can provide the support and the safety, the empowerment to address the impact. And so you're not broken. You know,
Yeah.
you are not beyond healing, you're not beyond repair. You know, healing is not only possible, but everything in our bodies and minds actively works towards healing us.
Yeah. So this is not a question I gave you beforehand. But so where does post traumatic growth show up?
Hmm. You didn't give me this question before, but
I want to put you on the spot. I know you know. Yeah, you'll be all right.
post traumatic growth shows up when, I think, one, it requires acknowledging that we have experienced something that has been traumatic. So, accepting the fact that I've experienced, whether it was a particular event or a series of events, I've experienced something that has affected me. And post traumatic growth comes up when it, in terms of our resilience, of saying, I notice how this is affecting me, I see how this is showing up, and I am going to be open to the process of healing. I'm going to be open to seeing what could be different. I think one of the things that happens with trauma is it affects our worldview. So we can have a worldview that is not growth focused, where we feel that things are irreparable. And so that growth happens when we're able to see there's a shift in our worldview. You know, when we're able to see those glimmers beyond the trauma that has happened to us and say, okay, there is something I'm growing towards, there's something I'm healing towards, there's something that I can tap into my own resources and ability to heal. You know, I have the ability to do this. And so
Yeah.
I that's where I'd say that comes in. It comes with acceptance, recognition, realization, but it also comes with, I can recognize what's happened to me, but I can also see something next. There's something else coming.
Danielle, I just want to tell you that this was incredible. I thank you for coming, for sharing. Um, uh, let's say someone knows or feels that they've experienced trauma and they want to sort of be free from the impact of it. Just as we close, what are some professional resources and personal resources that individuals can access to sort of get help and healing?
Yeah. I'm a therapist, so I do believe that if someone is seeking healing, seeking from a trauma-informed therapist, a therapist often who specializes in trauma is a good place to go. Someone who, focuses on methods that are, I think for Black people, somatic methods, mind-body connection methods, internal family systems, or someone who focuses in culturally informed trauma therapy and can integrate anti-oppressive and anti-racist frameworks into treatment as well. Uh, for people who are seeking healing, there are also resources such as the Black Emotional and Mental Health Collective. They have several different trainings and resources, and they're putting out information all about Black emotional and mental health and wellness. There are different foundations that provide resources, such as the Loveland Foundation, which helps to support Black people in getting access to uh, trauma-informed care. They provide grants sometimes for therapy, for people to pay for sessions. Resources such as therapy for Black girls or therapy for Black men, inclusive therapists. Those are all places where you can find resources and guidance to take that step. And if you're not ready to go to therapy yet, even just engaging with resources. So reading books related to trauma, such as I think a good one to start with could be, there's a book called Homecoming. And I believe, and don't quote me on this, I'll give you the resource, but
Yeah, we'll put them on the screen at the end of it.
I believe it's Dr. Thema Bryant who wrote that one. And that's a good place to start because I believe in what Dr. Thema also mentions is the fact that healing from trauma is really coming back to yourself. You are really coming home and getting reconnected with who you are. And I think that's a great place to start.
Yeah. Danielle, thank you so very much for this impactful and informative conversation. If you want to invite Danielle to your church to help you sort of navigate some of these things, or if you want to invite her to your organization, because I think she has a wealth of information and knowledge to share. Danielle, thank you very much, and I appreciate you. This was great. This was great.
Thank you.
All right. I want to thank everyone for joining us, and please join us for episode 3 in our mental health awareness series with Pastor Moses Nguna as he talks about the integration of faith and mental health. Have a wonderful day.